My guest today is Lynne Golodner, and she is a novelist, podcast host, writing coach, and she recently set up her own independent publishing house for women over 40 with strong voices that need to be heard. Her first novel, Woman of Valor, joins 2 poetry collections and 6 non-fiction books, including Hide and Seek, Jewish Women and Hair Covering, and The Flavors of Faith, Holy Breads. I really enjoyed Woman of Valor, and I'm excited to learn more about it and where it came from and the background to it. So welcome, Lynne.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel. I'm glad to be here.
I was fascinated by the book, and I was saying before we hit record, I've always been fascinated by Jewish culture
Mm-hmm.
and particularly Orthodox culture. I
Mm-hmm.
happen to live in a part of North London right next to a Hasidic community,
Mm-hmm.
and I am always seeing the men and the women. And in fact, at this time of year, which is spring, when the birds start nesting on the river, we share conversations about them because they will bring all of their children to see the swans on the nests, and
Sure.
it's lovely. It's a real community feel. So
Yeah.
first off, how did you become a writer?
I think I was born that way. Honestly, my mom will say I was 6 years old when I started writing stories, and so I'll go with that. But I've always been in love with books and fascinated by writing. It's how I make sense of the world. It's how I figure out what I think and believe and know about the world. And I often don't know what I think about something until I've written about it to make sense. So I've always done it, and always wanted a career as a writer, but sort of felt like, can I do that? Can you really make a living at it? So I sort of wrote around it for so many years. I was a journalist. I have a marketing company, all use writing skills. And I was writing books on the side all the while. But about 5 years ago, I decided I didn't want it to be on the side anymore. And I really shifted everything in my life so that writing could be my first priority and focus. And I hit the ground running. I've been thrilled ever since.
It's very exciting, isn't it, when you decide to do that? I've written in all guises as well, and I finally wrote a book. It's not a novel, although I have written a novel, but it sits in a drawer somewhere.
We
I'm
all have
probably
one
not.
of those. Yes,
I
you do.
know.
I do. Yes.
But why did you decide to focus on creating compelling Jewish characters?
So when I made this shift to focus on fiction, because my former books, 2 poetry collections, 6 nonfiction books, were out in the world, I started looking at, what are the themes in my writing and what kind of author brand do I want? And I was already writing about Jewish identity and compelling Jewish characters in nonfiction and even in poetry. I write a lot of creative nonfiction essays. I still do. And those are themes that keep coming up again and again because it's what I'm fascinated by. It's how I live. And so I made a decision to focus my novels on compelling Jewish characters. Now, Woman of Valor is a very religious story. My next novel, which comes out in August, is not about Orthodox Jews, but it's still about Jewish identity and belonging and figuring out who you want to be. So I wanted that consistency so that readers know what to expect when they pick up one of my books. And even though they're different stories, they have those similar themes.
And I'm interested that you decided to write about a very Orthodox Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, am I right about this? You don't yourself live a religious life. Is that right?
Not anymore. I was Orthodox for 10 years, my 20s to my 30s. And so I have that experience, but I left it when I ended my first marriage. And there are things I still love about it and that I carried into my life, but I say I'm just Jewish. I take and reject from each denomination equally. And so there are things I do that are still rather observant, and then there are things that I don't do.
So was that how you were able to embody your main character and her life?
I think so. I also did some research because Sally is not Orthodox in the way that I was. She's more religious than I was. And so I met with people. I did my research. I'm also not a runner. And so she's very much a runner, and that's a huge part of the book. So I spoke with some people who are Orthodox and run marathons, and, what would they wear and how would they cover their hair? And I wanted it to be authentic. So I knew some, and I found out what I didn't know.
It's fascinating that, yeah, because the description of, she's running in a skirt,
Yes,
and that
yes.
I was a runner. But regular listeners will know I've had problems with my knee, and I'm not running at the moment.
Oh, oh,
But yeah, I have an identity as a runner. I certainly was
uh-huh.
a runner, so it's really weird for me to have to think about, a woman running in a skirt, running. She's got to cover her hair
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
same time as she's running.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was fascinating actually for me. And she goes somewhere where she won't be seen, doesn't she? So
Yes.
that she
Yeah,
can run
yeah.
freely.
Yes. And that's very real. I actually, when I spoke with one friend who is a runner and was Orthodox until recently, um, she gave me some insights, but she also told me to follow a couple of women on social media, one of whom is a runner in the Olympics for Israel. And she's a mother of five. She's very religious, but just to follow her. And there was another woman who happens to live in Chicago where the book takes place. And I just still follow them, even though the book has been done for a long time. I find them fascinating, and now I'm a big fan. So it was really helpful just to see how they meld those aspects of themselves together.
I'm fascinated. So you'll have to let me know afterwards the accounts, and
Yes,
maybe we can put those in the show notes as well.
that sounds great.
Um, I found it, it's interesting for me to hear that, yes, you have lived an Orthodox life, because it felt to me as a complete outsider, but it felt so authentic, and I learned so much. I
Yeah.
don't know, is that partly what you're trying to do, is to actually teach the world about Orthodox Jewish life, or Jewish life and various types of Jewish life?
I think so. I think that you know, I love reading books about different cultures, different identities and ethnicities because I may never learn. And so in a novel, I really can inhabit that world. I recently read a book by a friend that takes place in Nepal. And I've never been, and there's a lot of food in there. There's landscape, and I found it fascinating. And I was thrilled that I could really go deep into that place that she knew. And so, I think it's really important to have all of these different identities and places in books so that we can build understanding. That people who are never going, maybe people who never interact with Orthodox Jews or Jews in general, especially given the climate of anti Semitism in the world today, why not learn a little bit about the culture and say, these are people just like me? And, but I still want it to be a great story. So that just happens to be part of the description of character, but it's still a story that has relationships and feelings and conflict and resolution, and it has to be a good story too.
I thought it was a beautiful melding of that, actually, because yes, I mean,
Thank
I
you.
found myself looking up words. I was Googling words all the time because I wanted to know what these meant. When you use the Yiddish words, I'm guessing it was, yeah.
Yiddish and Hebrew. And
And
it's interesting because I thought about, like, should I have a glossary? But does anybody ever look at a glossary? And I didn't want footnotes. And then, so I tried to include context so people could get the gist of it. It is a challenge because, I don't want to interrupt the storytelling with definitions, but I want readers to be on the same page. So I'll take that note for the future and make sure that the readers can understand it.
but I did. You're right. I did get the gist. I knew what you meant.
Oh, good.
But it was my curiosity. I wanted to know precisely what you meant. I
Sure.
wanted to understand the context of it, because
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I like that, and I like language, and I like you. I like learning about other cultures.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and the whole. I mean, I had read about the separation when women are menstruating, and
Yes.
that they have to go for the ritual bathing, but being taken all the way through that and actually understanding what that actually meant, because I may know about it as a sort of concept, but I don't know, what does it actually mean? And there was a line somewhere, wasn't there? Or was it in your head covering book, I think, where I'd never thought about this, but when a woman wears a wig, shaitel, is that right?
Shaitel,
Is that
yeah.
a shaitel?
Yeah.
She has to adapt her clothing to suit wearing a wig because her body temperature will have gone up because she's wearing the wig. And little details like that are just beautiful because they really bring it down to the really personal experience of what this is like and what it means.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was recently, just last week in Israel, I went to volunteer. And so on the plane, there were a lot of religious Jews of all different, communities. And I was just noticing the details. Like the women came on the plane in their wigs, but then because it's such a long flight, they went into the bathroom and they put on like a snood or a hat, something that's soft that they could sleep in. And then when we landed, the wigs came back out. It was just so interesting, It was like, oh yeah, like I don't have to worry about that now, but it's a reminder of when I lived that life. Yeah. So lots of
So,
details.
so you at one stage you did cover your hair and you,
I did. I didn't wear a
yeah.
wig. I wore hats, but I covered all of it for a number of years. And while I was still Orthodox, I actually stopped covering. But I was in a more modern Orthodox community, so that was accepted. Um, but yeah, I toyed with the idea of doing a shaitel, but they're very expensive,
Yes, I've
um,
heard that.
and there really aren't any curly ones. And so if I did, I mean, it's true. What they consider curly is like light waves, and my hair is very tight curls, and so I felt like
Yes.
then I'm a totally different person, and I just wasn't ready for that.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
Absolutely fascinating.
yeah,
And one of the another thing that really stuck out for me about the book was the role of food. There was a lot
yes,
of food in
a
it.
lot of food. Yes.
Was that part of your plan, or did it just happen as you were writing?
It was part of the plan, and I actually had wanted to do a supplement to be a companion piece to the book of all the recipes, but there were so many that I just was overwhelmed. And I have a list of them, but I want to write my next book, so I didn't do it. But it is such a part of an Orthodox existence because, first of all, your week focuses on Shabbat, so preparing for Shabbat, making menus, and then cooking and inviting people, then cleaning up from it, eating leftovers, planning the next one. But if you travel, you have to either go somewhere where there's kosher food or you have to take it all with you. And so if you want to go to more remote places in the world, it's a conundrum because, you're not going to find anything. So it's very much a part of that life. And it's interesting. I had one bad review, and it was that there was too much food in the book. And I thought, really? That's what you're going to complain about? Like, just then put it down and read something else. But I think that's part of my author brand too, because my next novel that's coming out, again, not Orthodox, but food is very much a part of the exchange and the relationships and the culture, because it takes place in Scotland and in Michigan, and so the food is a huge part of the culture, and I wanted that in there.
Yeah, it is massive. I think, and again, lots of these sort of words I've heard, because the other bit of my background that I think has led me to this fascination is that I had a Jewish godmother. And I know that's a
Wow.
contradiction in terms, but she
Yeah.
did go to church and she did promise to bring me up in the Christian faith.
I love it. That's so funny.
But I know it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
But she was
Yeah.
Jewish, so I always had that background. I remember my mum. My mum tells this wonderful story. So, my godmother delivered me. She was the
Oh,
midwife at the
that's so
hospital who
cool.
delivered me. I know, isn't that lovely?
Wow.
And
Yeah.
she delivered my brother as well before me.
Uh-huh.
So, or she was around. I think that was how they first met, and then she delivered me.
Okay.
But but when my mum invited her home, she didn't know that she was Jewish, and she served her ham and pineapple.
Of all foods, right?
Of all foods. I know, of all foods. But fortunately, my godmother wasn't keeping kosher, and
Sure.
she ate ham. So
Aw.
she said wasn't that observant at that stage. But
Yeah.
so it was all right. It was
That's so
okay.
funny. Oh
But
my
it was very
goodness.
funny. Yeah. So that was
Yeah.
my mum's, introduction to, having a Jewish friend who then
Yeah.
subsequently became my godmother, which is just bonkers, really. But
Wow,
it's a
that's
nice
really
story,
special.
isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. That's great.
Her name was Aida Michelson.
Oh,
Yeah,
beautiful. What a pretty
my
name.
it is, isn't it? My auntie Aida. Yes.
Nice. Oh, special.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? I like that
Yeah.
story. So I
Yeah.
think that definitely was sort of the start. And I remember also going to her, she didn't have her own children, but
Okay.
I remember going to her nephew's house for Shabbat dinner. And
Oh,
my first name is Rachel, obviously, which could be a Jewish name.
sure.
And in fact, my second name is Abigail. So it's
Oh,
quite Jewish, isn't it?
Abigail.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember her nephew asking me if I was able to go out on Fridays, and I didn't
Oh,
understand what that meant, But what it
yeah.
meant was, was I Jewish or not? Did
Right.
I celebrate Shabbat?
Yeah. Interesting. How special.
I know, it's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you've written about, as I was mentioning, that the women, they cover their hair and the reasons why they cover their hair and the different ways in which they cover their hair. And we've touched a little bit on that already. So how did that project come about for that book?
Yeah. So when I became religious, I was curious. I wanted to understand everything that I was obligated to observe. And so I read and I studied. I learned with partners who would teach me different things. And there was nothing out there about hair covering. So as I was preparing to marry my first husband, and I wanted to decide, am I doing this? Am I not doing this? I wanted to understand it all, and I couldn't find anything. And it was all anecdotal. It all also had to do with various communities. So in some communities, the women wore wigs, and others they wore hats, and others they didn't cover, and others they shaved their heads. And I was like, what is the difference here? Why? And there was nothing. So I said, well, I guess I will fill in the hole and I will create something. And, I was a journalist for 15 years. So I just started to research and interview and really dig into whatever I could find. And then I pitched the book idea to a couple publishers. I ended up with a publisher in Israel and had a very little advance, but that was exciting. And set about putting it together. And to my knowledge, it's the only book still that exists about Jewish women and hair covering, with Torah sources and different perspectives. And that came out in 2002. So I know it's gone through many printings. And it's funny, when I was in Israel, I met a fellow writer, and she's from England originally. She moved to Israel and she's religious. And she said, wait, I think I have that book on my shelf. And it's just the only one. So I was really thrilled at the, small degrees of separation. But I write to figure out what I believe. And so that was an example of it right there.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And that it is the only book of its kind. I
Yeah.
think it's incredible that does then open up that world to non-Jewish people so they can understand it. And
Yeah.
it still sort of blows my mind that there are so many layers sometimes to the hair covering, and that the shaving of the hair, it seems really alien to me. And yet,
Me too.
that just does it.
Yeah. And it's a very small sect. It's
Mm,
so many things about hair covering really have to do with fitting into the community that you're part of, and not necessarily about observing Torah. And
mm,
so there is a Torah source for it, but there's so many different interpretations.
mm,
And, I had a friend who was moving from America to Israel. And I said, oh, which community are you going to live in? And she said, well, it needs to be one where I can wear a wig, because I need to have hair. And in Israel, it's not necessarily the norm like it is in other cities around the world. Most of the women in Israel, when they cover their hair, they do it with scarves, or, it's not the norm to wear hair. It's more Americans or, Europeans or whatever. So it was about where she could feel like she fit. And that's important to distinguish.
mm. Yeah. It's often the community, isn't it, that
Yeah.
is driving things rather than actual religious law.
Yeah. I think that's the case everywhere. People are pretty
Yeah.
judgmental. And I always say, don't confuse Jews with Judaism,
Mm,
because Judaism it's like neither good nor bad. It's just there. But
mm.
individuals can make it wonderful or distort. And so I think we need to make our own decisions about what works for us and then find a way that we can be in a community, really.
And when, I hope you don't mind me asking, but when you decided to become religious, was that because you'd already met somebody who was religious, or did you become religious a bit like your characters and then decide that you wanted to marry somebody who was religious?
It was the latter. So I became religious on my own. I had lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years in my 20s, and I worked at a Jewish newspaper. And I had a colleague who was my mother's age who had become religious over the years. And she invited me for Shabbat, where I was sleeping at her house and had to follow all the rules. And I just fell in love with it. It was so peaceful, and her community was really welcoming and beautiful. And so that was my first taste. And I really wanted to live a more meaningful and purpose driven life. And I felt like that might give it to me. And so that's what attracted me to Orthodox Judaism. And then I ended up being introduced to my first husband once I moved back to Michigan, and I was really more embedded in the community. And yeah, it was interesting. While I was married to him, I sort of lost my idealism about it all. When I saw that there were examples of beautiful, purpose driven living. And then there was pettiness that exists in every community. And so
Mm,
while we were still married, I really tried to keep the peace because, he's always been religious and he didn't ask for me to reconsider. But when we divorced, I felt like it was more intellectually honest for me to live according to my conscience. And so there's a lot of ways that I'm still observant and traditional, but I also shed some of those observances. And we have 3 children together. So I know that was hard for my ex in the early years because when the kids were with me, which was most of the time, we didn't keep kosher. We didn't keep Shabbat. And so I know that frustrated him. But I really believe that it has to resonate for you. And you have to do um, religion in the way that really speaks to you. It's between you and God. So
mm.
yeah, that's ultimately what I did.
And I think it's fascinating that your main character, Sally, she never wavers in her faith.
Right.
It's the problems within the community that cause her to question things, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've had quite a lot of career pivots, haven't you, to get to where you are? So tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah. I started my career as a journalist in New York City and then in Washington, D.C. And I did that for 15 years. I ended up back in Michigan. But early on, I did an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Writing, which led to my first book being published, a collection of poems. And I also, it enabled me to teach at the college level, the university level. So even as I was a journalist, I would teach writing classes at different universities. And then in 2007, when the economy was really spiraling downward and I was contemplating a divorce, I really needed to think about a career pivot just out of necessity. A lot of the magazines that I wrote for were closing down, and I was divorcing, so I needed to make sure I had a reliable income. And so I decided to use my skills and see how I could appeal to businesses, like what could I do for them that would bring income? And so I created a marketing and public relations company that really took a storytelling approach because I knew media so well. And I've been doing that since, 2007, 2008. And it's really been very successful. I still do it to a degree, but I really shrank it when I decided to do a second pivot and focus on writing books. And when I did that about 5 years ago, I did it in steps so that I could still have reliable income, but focus my energies on writing. And I decided to ramp up my teaching at that time so that everything I was surrounded with had to do with writing. So I even made a decision for the marketing company. I kept 2 clients that I've had for a long time, But any new clients that I would take on, I decided would be in the writing realm. So authors or people in publishing. And and I even pivoted my podcast, which I had started in 2018. But when I made this shift, I started focusing on interviewing authors, and so that I could just everything I did would focus on writing, and it's been really wonderful.
Excellent.
Yeah,
We like a midlife pivot around here. It's very,
absolutely, absolutely, yep.
I'd love to know, because I'm always interested in other cultures. Um, have you noticed differences between Jewish and non-Jewish culture in terms of how older women are perceived?
It's an interesting question. I think I don't know. I think that in Western cultures, I think older women are sort of dismissed. And so, what's interesting is a friend of mine who's my age, one of my closest friends, and she's a nurse, and she said she was reading about cultures where women at midlife and older are revered, like they've come into their own and their full power. And she said in those cultures, they don't experience menopausal symptoms. And I'm like, what? Like, where can I move? Because
I
that's
wrote about that in my book. Yeah,
that's
it's true.
amazing. It's
Yeah.
amazing because it's like if you
Well,
feel
it's
like
much less. Anyway, it's much less.
sure, you feel like you don't have any purpose or value, it can lead to all kinds of things. And I do believe in that mind body connection to health and all of that. So, I think in Jewish culture, obviously the elders are really respected and honored, and I mean, grandparents are everything. Like, I can't wait to be a grandparent, and I keep telling my kids, and they roll their eyes, but I think that there is a place for the ancestors, the generations, to really be appreciated in Judaism. But I don't know that that's different than any other culture. I think it's more Western versus Eastern than it is various identities, really.
But is menopause a big thing in Jewish culture?
I don't think it's anything in Jewish culture. I don't know if anybody talks about it, to be honest. I did hear something. It was interesting. I heard something about a book, and I haven't read it. I don't know the title or the author, so I apologize. But it was a story about an Orthodox woman who had an oops baby, became pregnant like in her 50s or something. And it was a major scandal in her community because you're not supposed to be having sex at that point. And I was like, what? Like, really? So I'm glad I left, but it's like, that is interesting. In fact, I recently ran into a woman that I grew up with who also became Orthodox. She's much more religious than I ever was. And she's 3 years younger than me. I'm 52, so she's 49. And she had a baby 2 years ago. And when I knew this, my mom had told me because we're family friends, and this was her sixth child. And I ran into her recently. She said, "Oh yeah, I had a baby 2 years ago." I said, "I know, Mazel Tov. That's so exciting." And she looked shocked because I think the response that she's gotten was, "Oi, 47 having a baby," but I think it's beautiful. And so I think there are some preconceptions in Orthodoxy that after a certain point, it's done. So yeah.
I think that that can extend elsewhere as well. Certainly, in terms of length of relationship, there might be an assumption that there's not going to be that much going on in the bedroom. But yeah,
I
well,
mean,
the oops baby. I like that. I
right.
like that term. Very nice.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Very good. So, what led you to found your own publishing house?
That's an interesting journey, and one that I don't think I could have told you years ago I would have done. My first 8 books were published by publishers, and I assumed I'd do the same thing with my novels. So when I wrote Women of Valor, I started querying agents and publishers. I got some great responses. I was even offered a contract by a small press, but I turned it down because I felt like I just didn't want to jump through hoops at this point in life to make other people money. And I already had the validation that publishers thought my writing was worthwhile. Um, I also have a goal of writing a book a year for the rest of my life. Excuse me.
Wow. Oh
Yes,
my
I'm very
goodness.
ambitious. Um, and I didn't think that an agent or a publisher would keep up with that pace. It's just not customary in the traditional publishing world. And also, I didn't want anybody to tell me to water down the Jewish or not to write about certain topics because of world events. And it's a great example of right now, because my next book has a theme of anti-Semitism as one of the themes. And I had friends tell me, oh, you don't want to, release a book about anti-Semitism now. And I thought, absolutely I do. It's completely timely. So
Yeah.
that's why I started Scotia Road Books. And I also didn't do it as just a self-publishing firm, because I figured if I was feeling this way, there would be other women at midlife who were feeling this way, and I wanted to be a support for them. So it's not intended for me to really make money. It's intended for me to lift other women up. I have a friend, a really good friend, who had a book come out around the same time as Woman of Valor. She's an amazing writer. She's traditionally published, and she started writing another book and pitched it to her editor. And she's in her late 50s, the author, and she was writing about a late 20s character. And the editor said, oh, I don't think a 50-something author can write a 20-something character. And so they just scrapped it. And I was angry on her behalf, because why can't she? I mean, I read early pages and it was really good. But she took it in stride, and she started on another book, and they bought that, which is really exciting. But I didn't like that response. And her editor is like 30. So I thought, who is she to say that she can't write a believable 20-something character? And again, I don't want to bump up against that. I want to write the book that I want to write. So that's why I started it.
That's actually very ageist, isn't it? You think
It
about
is.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Only a young person can write from a young person's perspective, even if an older person has been a young person once.
Right. I mean, shouldn't we
Like,
be able to
duh.
write all characters, Like I could write a
Exactly.
male character. I could write
Oh.
we should be able to try. And hopefully if we pull it off, we can be celebrated for that.
Yeah. So have you faced any challenges with setting this up?
Not yet, knock on wood, poo, 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 all the things. But I have not, and I'm really fortunate. I know there are a lot of Jewish authors that are being canceled right now. There are a lot of publishing houses and literary publications that are saying they won't accept any submissions from Zionists. They won't accept any submissions about Israel. They won't accept Jewish stories. And it breaks my heart, because I don't know how that benefits anybody. But thankfully, it has not extended to me, and I hope it doesn't.
And when you're doing it yourself, you can, to some extent, you can ride roughshod over that, can't you? I mean, I decided I didn't want to wait. I would have to get an agent, then I'd have to be pitched to a publisher, then it
Right.
would be 2 years before it was published. And I wanted it published now, like yesterday.
Right. Yes,
That's what I wanted.
totally.
It's like, I don't want to wait that long. I need to get this out there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I totally agree. I think, when I was coming up, it wasn't acceptable to publish yourself. I'm glad that's changed. And there's
Mm.
certainly, there are terrible books out there, but they're not all self-published. I mean, there are books by publishers that are not great quality, and it's
Yeah.
also subjective. So I feel like
Mm.
I'm glad we have the options. And I think you come into your own at a certain point at midlife, and you say, I'm doing it my
Yes.
way, and I'm not going to apologize for it. And I'm really okay with that. So
Mm.
I think that's what makes midlife really cool, honestly.
And what else have you learned about yourself as you've gone through midlife, as you're going through midlife?
Well, I've always been impatient, and I definitely need to build patience, and I'm still working on that. Um, I don't like other people telling me what to do. And while I tried to change that in younger years, I no longer try to change it now. Um, but I've also really learned to enjoy the ride. And I will say that other women authors are the best support. I'm a part of the Women Fiction Writers Association, and I have never been in such a supportive, encouraging community. And it's just beautiful. Not competition and trying to undercut each other. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that at this point, I don't have any patience for people who are jealous or competitive, because there's enough room for all of us. And so why not
Yeah.
lift each other up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we get older, as we go through midlife, some of that competition that we used to have, it kind of goes away a little bit. Not always, but I think there is less competition against women, because when we're younger, we're always competing over the best mate, aren't we? I think there's an element of that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, post-menopause, in menopause, it all becomes a bit different. That's my experience anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, I don't know about you, but when I was younger, the things I was looking for in a mate were probably unrealistic. And the things I cherish now are just really, about partnership and kindness and joy. I am remarried, and my husband and I have so much fun together, and it's cooking together and sitting on the couch is like beautiful. And that wasn't always the case. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, as we wind up, I would like to ask you, what would you most like women to know?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that what I've learned from teaching a lot of women at midlife who are writing, and, going through my own journey, is that what holds us back is a lack of self-confidence and a lack of self-belief. And so that's what we want to focus on. And so in my writing classes, I feel like I'm teaching that more than craft or, narrative structure. It's believing in yourself and having the confidence to use your voice and know that it has a power. And I think that women tend to second guess ourselves. And why should we? We are here to make a difference, and we can if we use our voice. And so I think that's important.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.